in just diving right into the lecture. Thank you for being here this afternoon, for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining me for this lecture. Especially like to thank the students who are here only at the behest of their professors, one of them being me. So the title of the lecture this afternoon is the International Climate Change Regime on the Verge of Breakthrough or Breakup. Now, scientists believe that greenhouse gases are causing, or produced by human activities, are causing an enhanced greenhouse effect, which is more popularly known as global warming. So I'm kind of nervous appearing before my students. Now, this global warming, in turn, results in other phenomena like extreme weather events, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and other natural calamities or threats, or other threats to human life and to property. This is climate change. And its effects are commonly referred to as climate change impacts. There are those who say climate change phenomenon is still not established as a scientific fact, that there are some doubts whether climate change or global warming is in fact caused by human activities. Well, maybe this illustration would put these objections in their proper perspective. Out of the 13,950 peer-reviewed climate articles, papers written by scientists, reviewed by scientists, from 1991 to 2012, only 24 reject global warming. So those who object to the existence or the phenomenon of global warming belong to that tiny sliver of red over there. So majority of the scientists of the world believe that there is global warming, there is climate change, and that it is caused by human activities. And if these scientists are correct about the current and future climate change impacts, then urgent global action is required. The global action required must be for the purpose of reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is called mitigation, and actions to prepare for climate change impacts, which is called adaptation. The reason why we must engage in adaptation and not only mitigation is simply because even if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases as of this point, the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere will already cause climate change impacts. So regardless of what we do, we need to be prepared. At the forefront of all these efforts for mitigation and adaptation is the International Climate Change Regime. The regime has been working since the 1990s. It has met many times, produced volumes of decisions and documents, but until now there has been no real solution to climate change. In fact, the temperature of the world has continued to increase. There has been no change in the rate greenhouse gases are escaping into the atmosphere. Because of this rather slow pace, the glacial pace of progress under the current regime, it's not surprising that people are now asking, is there a better way? Is there a faster way to arrive at the solution that we need? Climate change creates problems for us that are very urgent, but the way the regime is working, it's been very, very slow. It's almost like a stationary bike. There's been a lot of activities. There's been a lot of activity, a lot of calories have been burned, but it hasn't really gotten anywhere. We're still where we are at the start of the regime. Now this lecture is based on a paper which attempts to evaluate some of the proposed alternatives to the current regime. In the interest of time, and in the interest of keeping you awake, I will not mention every part of the paper, but hopefully only the parts that you would find interesting or at least useful. And no, it will not come out in your torts exam. The paper is divided into 5 parts. Part 1 summarizes the problems associated with climate change. Part 2 discusses the challenges inherent to the problems, the nature of climate change itself, and the nature of international relations and international law. Part 3 reviews the limitations of the current regime. Part 4 describes the alternative models. And 5 analyzes these models and gives or offers a perspective. Part 1, the problem. As I've mentioned already, and as most of you, if not all of you already know, human activities have been releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for centuries, but the rate has exponentially increased in the last few decades, specifically since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The greenhouse gases in the atmosphere produce an enhanced greenhouse effect that we know as global warming. So we have a warming Earth. A new analysis, I think, which only came out this year from the World Meteorological Organization, says that average land and ocean surface temperatures from 2001 to 2010 rose above the previous decade and were almost a ½ degree Celsius above the 1961 to the 1990 global average. Meaning, in the past 10 years or so, it's been the hottest it has been for a very long time. And if trends continue as they have for the past few years, the next 10 years will be even hotter. So we have a warming Earth, and it produces other problems for all of us. As I've mentioned, extreme weather events. There are many examples, but just to pick 2 that happened just this year. In June, there was widespread flooding in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and parts of Hungary and the Czech Republic, which has been the worst in its history. In fact, for Germany, it was the worst flood in 400 years. In July, the Marshall Islands, just one month after they declared a state of emergency because of a severe drought, they then faced high tides, which flooded their capital and their airport. There are displaced populations. In 2008, several years ago, the United Nations estimated that there were 20 million people that were displaced because of climate change. And in the long term, their projection was 200 million refugees. Now, while there may be a debate on exactly what is a climate change refugee, whether there is such a thing as a climate change refugee under international law, and exactly how many climate change refugees there really are, it cannot be denied that even now, there have been many communities that have to relocate to avoid the harsh impacts of climate change. As these impacts increase in severity, in number, in coverage, more and more people would be displaced. You also have threatened food security. According to one study released this year as well, climate change is helping pests and diseases that attack crops and spreading all over the world, threatening food security. It appears that the warming temperatures make it possible for such pests and pathogens to create more damage to larger areas of the world. Now, if you were to add this to the effects of extreme weather events, we know for a fact that when a typhoon goes through the country, millions worth of crops are destroyed. You add that to the pests, you add that to droughts, which are also caused by climate change, then you see how world food security is affected by this problem. But there are also challenges inherent, the part 2, challenges inherent to the problem. It's not just the impacts, but the nature of the problem itself. It is a global problem. As Michael Hahnemann explains, there are 3 main components to climate change: a change in temperature, a change in precipitation, and a change in sea level triggered by a change in temperature. Although these play out differently in different timescales, whether it's a temperature change or a sea level rise or a change in precipitation, every single person on the planet is affected. Climate change affects every single one of us. Furthermore, the source of the problem is global. What causes greenhouse gases to be emitted into the atmosphere human activity. Of course, they are natural causes. But what we're talking about here are anthropogenic sources, meaning human-induced climate change. From the time I started this lecture until now, 13 minutes or so, we have contributed to the climate change problem. Simply by sitting here, by enjoying the air conditioning, by using up electricity, by you producing certain gases. But we all contribute. There is no one who is innocent of the problem. Therefore, the cause and effects of climate change are global. And because it's a global problem, it requires a global solution or global cooperation. As Yamin in the Pledge has written, the atmosphere knows no boundaries. Acting alone, no country can hope to arrest climate change, but collective action by sovereign states with that disparate socio-economic and environmental circumstances is difficult. States acting individually, no matter how rich or no matter how powerful, if they merely act individually, they will not be able to limit emissions to the point that it precludes dangerous buildup of greenhouse gases. Developed and developing countries must contribute to the mitigation and adaptation efforts. The actions of even a few committed states is not enough. Although in certain security issues in the world, coalitions of the willing might be sufficient. When it comes to climate change, coalitions of the willing will not be sufficient. Because it's also a global problem, it creates incentives for free riding. It's strange, but the fact it's a global problem, instead of becoming a motivation for global cooperation, the fact it's a global problem actually has given some people an excuse, or some states an excuse. Because of the global character of the atmosphere, or the atmospheric resource, the benefits of mitigation measures that one country might employ or might adopt will benefit everyone, although he or that state bears the costs alone. So why would a country incur the economic cost of mitigation efforts if other states who do not take the same economic measures will benefit as well? Those who do so unilaterally will be at a disadvantage. And those who want to take advantage of this would simply just allow other states or other nations to undertake the measures. They will benefit anyway. So there are incentives for free riding. The problem is also pervasive, but there is uneven distribution. Climate change impacts every aspect of society. It affects not only the environment, it affects the way we conduct our business, social relationships, business relationships. It has profound consequences on every aspect of human society. The economies of most, if not all, states are built on activities that produce greenhouse gases. Thus, the effects of climate change and any climate change-related action, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's border adjustments, whether it's some form of cap-and-trade system, whether it's a clean development mechanism, all of these measures that have been suggested would have impacts on every single member of society. But the costs of these measures will not be the same. Developing countries would have a hard time financing these efforts. And the sad twist of fate here is these developing countries, the Philippines included, historically have not caused as much damage or have not contributed as much greenhouse gases as the developed countries. And yet they bear much more of the cost. They lack the capacity to be able to undertake these measures. And more than that, according to studies, the countries who are developing are located in the parts of the world that will bear the brunt of climate change impacts. So climate change actually also creates some equity issues. And this is what I just mentioned. I guess I went ahead of myself. The other thing is that It's an intergenerational problem. The effects of climate change are being felt now, but according to the studies, more of this will be felt later on. So it's an intergenerational problem because present generations are expected to pay the cost for the benefit of their successors. 2 or more generations, not successors, sorry about that, several generations into the future. Politicians may not be as motivated to make unpopular decisions now, considering that those who will benefit will still be in the future. So there's a problem in trying to enact measures now. There is also a problem because of the nature of international relations and international law. First, you have uneven and fluctuating support. The photograph in front of you is a picture of the latest G20, and it represents the most powerful, the richest nations of the world. Now, despite wide-ranging climate change impacts, the support for climate change action globally fluctuates from country to country. It has not been uniform. There are certain countries or groups of countries like the EU, which seems to be more aggressive in pushing for climate change measures. And then you have countries like Saudi Arabia, Bolivia, Venezuela, China to some extent, that are not as aggressive. But even within countries themselves, like the United States, you have pockets of support and you have pockets of opposition. So the support has been uneven throughout the world, and it changes from time to time. It depends on who's the political party in power. So how can you produce some form of regulation if the support that you get from countries changes every election? And international law or international relations is still pretty much state-centered. It's still largely a game of states. States, as a general rule, do not make decisions on the basis of a global cost-benefit analysis. The President of the United States or the Premier of China, they don't make decisions thinking, well, what would be good for the world? They instead make decisions primarily following a calculus of national costs and benefits, shaped to a greater or lesser extent by the cost-benefit perceptions of their citizens, of organized interest groups, and of powerful governmental and non-governmental institutions. We also have international disunity. World politics, even up to this time, is so fragmented. Countries cannot agree on even the most crucial of issues. The latest, for example, what to do about chemical weapons in Syria. In the climate change context, you have the same thing. In fact, that is one of the problems of the climate change negotiations. The conflicts that countries have elsewhere, because of other issues, are translated into the climate change negotiations. You can see this as well in the negotiating blocks that you have in the UNFCCC. You have the developing world and China in one block. You have a block called the Umbrella Group. You have a block called the Environmental Integrity Group. You have all of these different factions. It's almost like Survivor. Climate change also challenges current paradigms on what international law or what international law is at this time. Similar to international environmental law issues that require global cooperation, climate change challenges the traditional paradigms of state responsibility, sovereign equality, and state consent. Up to this day, the primary source of international law are still international treaties and customs, and you have subsidiary means. But these types of lawmaking this type of lawmaking methodology is not adequate when it comes to climate change rulemaking. because rules need to be enacted quickly in response to scientific data. So there are questions now whether the COP decisions of the UNFCCC constitute international law. Part 3, limitations of the regime. What is the regime? Well, a regime is a set of rules, regulations, and institutions relevant to a particular subject area. When you talk about international relations, it is a set of implicit or explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a given area in international relations. So, in other words, a regime is how things are done. What are the rules? Who's in charge? Who makes decisions? It's the process, the rules, the decision-making. Now, for purposes of the paper, I define the international climate change regime as the international legal and institutional framework established by the international community to manage the climate change problem. The legal framework is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol. These are the two treaties that are global in nature, that are specifically created for climate change purposes. The institutional framework are composed of all the institutions that arise out of these legal instruments. This is what I mean by the international climate change regime. What are the design features of this regime? It's universal, meaning most countries of the world, nearly every single country in the world is a state party, not just a signatory, but a state party to the UNFCCC. It includes all countries virtually, but only countries. It establishes a division by development, meaning the responsibilities under the treaties are divided on the basis of the level of development of the state party. Developing countries have certain responsibilities, developed countries have other responsibilities. So there is a north-south divide crystallized in the treaties themselves. The current strategy of the regime, some of the criticisms against it, I noted here. First, it makes emissions limitations legally binding. You would think, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that exactly what we need? Well, yes, a lot of people agree that the only way to make sure that the states of the world adhere to regulations that would limit emissions is to make sure it is binding, that it is legally binding, that it is law, that it is in the form of a treaty. But it has created problems. This strategy has resulted in the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. The UNFCCC is universal, but it doesn't provide for specific measures that will make sure that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will be reduced. It's a framework convention. Everyone agrees to it because there's really nothing specified there that would bind them to do anything they don't want to do. And then you have the Kyoto Protocol. It has specific targets. Countries who are state parties to it have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to a certain degree using certain methods specified in the Kyoto Protocol. What's the problem? It's not universal. The US is not a state party. China and other developing countries are not state parties. So the result of this strategy so far has been two extremes. A universal treaty but doesn't do anything specifically, and a treaty that provides for specific binding obligations, but it's not universal. You could also say that the strategy of the regime is all in. For those of you who play poker, you know exactly what I mean. If you don't play poker, start playing. So you'll understand what I mean. But this refers to the strategy of the regime that it includes in whatever treaty that would come out all the possible greenhouse gas emission sources all the possible rules in one document, a package deal. It's all in. You can't just have a treaty that limits emissions from mining or emissions from certain industries. You cannot separate a treaty on RED or reduction of emissions through forest degradation. You cannot. You have to combine all of these rules in one document. Why? Because of the North-South divide. People in the North, or countries in the North, or the developed countries want certain things included in the treaty. The South, led by China, wants certain things included in the treaty. So for the South to agree to what the North wants, the North has to agree to what the South wants. So it's a package deal. The result, no deal. It's all or nothing. There's also a top-down approach, exemplified best by the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is top-down because the countries or the state parties decide how much each state must reduce. Each state must therefore then go back to their countries and enact legislation to make it happen. Top-down. The opposite, bottom-up. Example, the Copenhagen Accord. That states simply make pledges to what they want to do, and all that the UNFCCC will do is monitor if it's being done or not. So the states themselves tell the regime what they're going to do, instead of the regime telling the states what to do. Another criticism of the regime is that it lacks compliance mechanisms. There's not enough teeth. There's no way to enforce or to punish, for instance, China if it does not abide by the obligations under the treaty. Then again, can't you say the same thing for almost every aspect of international law? There is a problem of enforcement. But it's not just enforcement, but the absence of incentives. Although you could argue that the Kyoto Protocol does provide for incentives, even for developing countries, it simply is not enough. So let's talk about the alternative models. There's been a lot of complaints about the current regime. It's not doing anything. It's not moving. We have all of these meetings, but nothing's going on. Or a lot of things going on, but nothing substantial has occurred. So what can we do? I'm giving two examples of alternative models. The first model suggests an approach for breaking up the regime into smaller regimes. The second model argues that the existing regime is already broken up, and we should break it up even more. Let's talk about the building block regime, or rather the building block approach. The proponents of this is Stewart and his friends. Stewart says that this approach does not intend to include all countries. Because some countries just don't want to play ball. Okay, fine. We'll just get the countries who want to do something about climate change, and we'll come up with something together. It provides for certain guidelines on how to produce different smaller kinds of regimes. There will be no across-the-board developing country division, because in these regimes, there will be no division. Developed and developing countries will have responsibilities, they will have partnerships. These regimes will target particular economic sectors or regions, not all in. These regimes would minimize the cost of regime failure by diversification, meaning they'll try different things, different approaches. And it will try to make progress because the idea is that smaller regimes will be easier to manage. There will be greater confidence and trust because you know each other. There's greater monitoring because it's a smaller regime. Easier to call meetings, easier to get things done. It basically has three main strategies. First, the building block approach seeks to tap non-climate objectives. It seeks to tap non-climate motivations through incentives for governments, subnational jurisdictions, firms, consumers to take self-interested actions that will further climate protection. Now, what does this mean? The proponents of this approach understand that not every single person in the world is an environmentalist. But we need to come up with a way to convince all these people that it's to undertake measures that will benefit the climate. So you look at non-climate change objectives that would have a positive benefit to climate. For instance, you establish regimes that would focus on reducing energy costs. You focus on regimes that focus on renewable energy. You focus on regimes that tries to reduce the dependence on imports of oil or other objectives that are not directly climate change objectives, not directly mitigation, but objectives might even be economic, but would have benefits to the environment. The strategy of this regime will also include leveraging pockets of mitigation support through linkages with existing institutions. Meaning, there are already certain regimes all over the world, certain groups, certain networks, so you take advantage of that. These networks, these groupings, for example, the ASEAN, was not established for the purpose of climate change. But you can take advantage of that organization by including other activities, programs, and projects within that grouping that would benefit climate change efforts. And the third strategy is that it tries to promote all of these measures to dominant actors. It means that the building block approach does not wait for everyone to agree. We'll look for key countries, key jurisdictions, key market actor, or key multinational companies for that matter, that could make an impact on other nations or other corporations. And we'll start with them. And we'll use that to somehow change the regulations because of the dominant actor's ability to influence his or its industry. The proponents mention three specific types of regimes or approaches: the club strategy, the linkage strategy, and the dominant actor strategy. Club strategy, well, basically a club. No, it's not the place you go to on Friday night. A club is a particular type of grouping, a cooperation game. Individuals join clubs because they want to have a certain group benefit. You can apply that in the context of states. States group together because they want to enjoy certain club benefits. So you try to form a club for the purposes of climate change or some other non-climate objective. And the problem, however, is that climate or the atmosphere is not a club good. What's a club good? A club good is something that you can use exclusively for the club, that you can exclude others. That's the whole benefit of a club. That's, for instance, when the example I can think of is kids forming a club and building a tree house. That's their club benefit. Why would you want to join the club? So that you can make use of the treehouse. If you don't join the club, you can't play there. But if every single kid in the neighborhood can come up to the treehouse anyway, why join the club? The problem with the climate is that it's a treehouse that everyone can use. You can't really exclude people. So the club good, when you use the club strategy, would have to be non-climate objectives. The linkage strategy. The strategy here is that you take an existing regime and you use the current relationship, the current programs, and somehow find a way to connect it to climate change related measures. And you try to further that. An example would be extending the Montreal Protocol. I don't know if you're familiar with the Montreal Protocol, but it's a treaty considered to be largely effective and successful, which has banned the use of ozone-depleting chemicals. The thing about the Montreal Protocol is that if you add some more chemicals to the list of banned chemicals, if you include some greenhouse gases into the list, you could have a positive effect on the climate. Another example would be using the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution. It's not a treaty or a convention about climate change, but you can take advantage of that arrangement to come up with a climate change beneficial measure. And then you have the dominant market actor strategy, which could simply be called the California or the Brussels effect. What does that mean? Well, California, as we probably know, is very active in coming up with climate change related legislation. So what happens is that if a company wants to do business or wants to sell its products in California, it has to comply with the regulation of that state. It makes no sense for a car manufacturer to only manufacture cars for California. The economies of scale, if you're going to make the standards high, make the standards high for all the products you're going to sell to all the states. So even though it's just California who comes up with some form of regulation, it affects all the states. It affects the products sold to all states. The same thing with what you call the Brussels effect, which is the EU. Even if it's only the EU that comes up with certain regulations that benefit the climate, even if the US doesn't follow, companies who do business in the EU would have to comply with that regulation. And in some measure, translate those changes to their products and the way they do business, the way they produce energy, to their efforts as well in other jurisdictions. The other model is the regime complex. Kyohane and Victor argue that instead of a strong, integrated, and comprehensive regulatory system for managing the climate, the efforts of governments have produced a varied array of narrowly focused regulatory regimes. They are basically arguing, and they're not the first ones to say so, that the current regime anyway is already fragmented. It's already a complex, and it's better that way. It's basically Kyohane and Victor would disagree with my definition of the international climate change regime. They would say, no, the regime is not limited to the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. It is much broader, more fragmented than what you suggest. They point to what they call a regime complex for climate change. And the Kyoto Protocol, the UN process, is just an aspect of that regime. It recognizes other multilateral international organizations as being part of the climate change regime. And their argument is that because of the nature of climate change, we have no choice. It will be like this. And in fact, it would be better that it stays this way. A regime complex. Another author, Abbott, wants to take it farther. He says that, well, Kyohane and Victor, they've not gone far enough. The regime is actually far broader. You have a governance triangle. What Abbott suggests is that you include in the regime all types of private organizations, all different arrangements, businesses, anybody that somehow has an effect on climate change internationally or locally, you put them all in this governance triangle. And what he is saying is that what we need to have is a transnational climate change regime that would bring non-state actors. Abbott, if you read his papers, you would sense, well, his frustration with certain states which he calls recalcitrant states. States who just refuse to help out and try to do something about the climate. So what he proposes is that let's bring in non-state actors. Let's bring in NGOs. Let's bring in companies. Let's bring in individuals into the regime. And that will be the regime that will govern climate change. The advantages of a regime complex over an integrated monolithic regime is that according to Abbott and Kyohane and Victor, a regime complex would be more adaptable. It can make changes quickly. It's more flexible. What happens with a monolithic regime, according to them, is that you have what you call path dependence. What's path dependence? Once you've decided on a path, even though you realize it's not working, you still keep on doing the same thing. Because it's like inertia, you can't stop. You've gotten used to doing things a particular way that even though it's not working anymore, you still keep on doing it. Kind of like how you study for law school. You know, you become path dependent, you become rigid. You're not flexible enough to try different things that will actually work. Now, what can we say about these proposals? And I'm now in the last part of my lecture. We have to look deeper into these proposals. We have to analyze them closely. Is it really, what are they proposing? Are they proposing a building block, or can it be a stumbling block? Definitely, when you have a big regime, it's hard to organize. It's like organizing a party. It's easier to organize a party with a small group of friends than your entire class. Because there's less few people to call, less few interests and food choices to consider. A smaller group, easier to move, faster to make decisions. And there are benefits to it. Even if these small regimes cannot produce enough mitigation that would solve the problem of climate change, they could at least add to what you call the ambition gap. Whatever else we need to do to reach the goal of not having global temperatures increase beyond 2 degrees Celsius. The problem, however, is that even Stewart and his friends admit that in order for these regimes to be successful, they need certain funding from the financing institutions. They need support. The same type of support that the UNFCCC now is asking for the developing countries. So the problem with creating the regimes could be that yes, they have some benefits, but they could also deprive developing countries and existing measures of the UNFCCC, the funding, the support that they need. If you look at the history of the negotiations of the UNFCCC the past few years, the developing countries have always been complaining, you're not giving us enough money, you're not giving us enough funding. And now, if you establish these regimes, the funding will dry up much more quickly. Because if they will go to these smaller regimes. So that's one problem. The other thing is, yes, we have a complex problem, and maybe a regime complex, a complex solution might be a good thing, but a complex solution can also create more complex problems. A regime complex is adaptable. It can do a lot of things in different places. It can be flexible. But the problem with the complex is that there is a lack of coordination. If everyone is free to do whatever they want and it's not centralized, an effort of one group could virtually counteract the efforts of another group. There could be regime conflicts. There could be certain practices that contradict each other, certain activities that compete against each other. And because there is no coordination, we do not know if when you add all of the measures together, will they actually reach the objective that we want? Will we if you add all the effects of all the regimes together, will we reach the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we need? We don't know that if you have a complex, because everyone is doing their own thing. And we're not reporting to a central authority. Abbott, like I said, wants a transnational complex regime so that he can bypass recalcitrant states. States that always object in the negotiations for anything, anything that will produce a strong result, they will object to it. So what Abbott suggests, let's just bypass them. Let's just not include them. Masyado naman silang KJ. So let's not include them in the group anymore. The problem is, if you bypass certain states, it might create backlash. I understand the frustration, but if you exclude authoritarian regimes, they can make things difficult for you as well. Abbott's plan requires the support of individuals and groups within states, even the recalcitrant states. So if you bypass the government authorities, there's no stopping them from preventing their citizens, their nationals, the corporations registered in their jurisdiction from participating in any climate change related measure. There could be a backlash. And in fact, if you isolate them, you exclude them, you could solidify their opposition to any climate change measure in the future. The path of resistance is not necessarily the right path. I say this because as I read the literature, all the arguments being raised for all of these proposals, it's like the authors are saying, it's just so hard to come up with a treaty. It's just so difficult. We've been trying and it's not working. There's so many, it's not possible to do this, or it's not possible to do that. This is the only thing that's possible right now. We cannot come up with a top-down approach. Let's just do bottom-up. Let the states decide on their own what they want to do. Because that's the only thing that's possible right now. We can't really convince China to change its mind, or the US Congress to change its mind. The problem with that kind of thinking, however, is that just because this is the thing that is possible right now, it doesn't mean that it will be enough. It's just because it's the easy way to do a thing doesn't mean that's what you need to do. It will not necessarily produce the results that we want. I'll explain this in a little while in another point. So if we analyze all of these proposals, we need to look further. I think the priority, what we've been talking about, I understand we have some architecture students in the room. I don't know why your architecture professor brought you here. You can blame him. The climate change regime is somewhat about architecture. How you structure the global regime to come up with the results that you want. The proposals I discussed today is focused on the structure, on the architecture, whether it should be a complex or a building block. But in reality, I think the focus should not really be the structure, but the goal. Our eyes should be focused on the prize. The determination of the solution must begin with the determination of what is necessary. If scientists say that we cannot survive as a planet beyond a 2 Celsius degree increase in temperature, then that is the goal. We then have to figure out what mitigation efforts are required so that we hit that goal. We don't go beyond 2%. We don't go beyond 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What do we need to do to achieve that? We also need to see what it would take for us to adapt to the impacts of climate change. If this were to happen, what do we need to do to prepare ourselves? We should be focused on the goal, not on the structure. What do we need to do? And once we figured out what we need to do, then we establish the structure. Then we establish the measures. The focus, I think, on the structure, on what kind of regime that we should have, I think is not the proper priority. The priority should be the measures. This is not to say that the structure or the architecture is not important. The structure is important, but it's important because it tells us what kind of regulation becomes possible. For instance, if you look at the global legal structure versus our national legal structure, it's very different. We enact laws differently. We enforce laws differently. So we cannot have frameworks that will, or regulations that will work at a national level and expect it to work at a global level. So to that extent, structures are important. We need to analyze what current structure do we have so that we do not come up with a measure that does not fit the structure. We cannot come up with a measure that requires some form of global government when we don't have a global government. We cannot come up with a solution that requires some form of global legislature because we don't have a global legislature. So to some extent, the structure is important, but it's not the most important thing. I think as well that we need to have, if I just may be allowed to take a drink of water. Too late, I already drank. I can go on for another hour. All right. We need to have inclusive solutions. It's frustrating. If you take the time to read the negotiations, you'd really hate certain countries. You'd probably not want to visit them anymore. Because they're just making it hard for the world to come up with a good solution to climate change. But we need to come up with inclusive solutions. As Teresa Rivera said, what is needed is to go beyond the private interest and find solutions in which everyone feels they're forming part of a global solution. Why is that important? I think environmentalists must recognize that they cannot come up with a climate change solution that would require everyone in the world to be converted into environmentalists. The measures that we come up with as a regime, if we come up with a regime, should be something that even the climate change skeptic would buy into. That's the only way. It has to be something that would not require, climate change sinners be converted to climate change saints all of a sudden. You cannot wait for that to happen. That's not realistic. So you have to come up with a solution that even states who don't care about the environment, they buy into it. That's the kind of solution that we would need. And we need to diversify approaches. A lot of people like to focus on cap and trade. Some people focus on carbon tax. They prefer some form of engineering, putting iron fillings into the ocean so it produces algae. And I think some guy tried to do that and he got arrested in Canada. Some students actually did that as part of their project and they got arrested. We need to diversify approaches in the sense that perhaps these proponents like Abbott and Kyohane are correct that we cannot just be state-centric. Solutions to climate change cannot simply be at the governmental level. I think they have a point in suggesting that we should have measures that are at a sub-governmental level, that are at the level of private citizens. Because eventually, in order for the planet to be able to not emit as much greenhouse gases as it is now, would require every single one of us changing our habits, changing our consumer preferences, changing the kinds of things that we like to eat, the things that we'd like to do, the things that we'd like to buy. It would have to go to the level of the individual. So you have to really diversify your approaches. You can't wait for and say, hey, let's look for that silver bullet solution, that panacea, that magic elixir that will solve all of the problems, that technology fix, that diet pill that would allow us to reduce weight without doing any exercise, that would also cure cancer and provide world peace at the same time. I mean, it will not happen. And we would probably need to try a whole menu of approaches to be able to solve climate change. And this is my favorite. I think we need to avoid half-speed pump solutions. This is not the actual picture of the street, but let me tell you a story. A few weeks ago, I passed by the street near a preschool, and the school, I think it was the preschool, they put half-speed bumps or half humps. Kung ito yung school, half here, half there. The idea is that so that cars coming from that direction heading towards the school would slow down. So cars from that direction heading to the school would slow down. Hindi nila binuo. They didn't make it a full speed bump, crossing the entire street, because they don't really need cars leaving the area to slow down. They only need cars going to the area to slow down. So they must have thought, wow, this is a brilliant solution. We get the same result for half the price, because we don't have to spend for an entire speed bump. Kasi we have the same effect. So what's the problem? Human nature came in. Cars saw the speed bumps, but instead of slowing down, hey, it's not complete. I could swerve. So instead of creating a zone of safety for the students crossing that street, it became a nuisance. It became a source of risk. It became more dangerous for students to cross that street, because you have cars trying to beat each other, reaching that part so they could swerve. So they were speeding, they were swerving in that area. The situation became worse than before. Well, a few days ago they completed the speed bump. So now they have, they must have realized that, and so they spent what they should have spent to begin with. So what's the lesson? I think we should be careful about really ingenious solutions that produce the result but at half the price. Because there might be certain costs or certain unintended consequences that would actually make things worse. And when we come up with measures, okay yung half speed bump kasi maybe it was good because you could reverse it later on anyway, you could complete it. But certain measures, if they are irreversible, I think we should watch out for that, because we don't know what the effects will be. I specifically point to efforts on geoengineering, changing, it's like terraforming, changing our atmosphere through some artificial means, or like the iron filings in the ocean, or some other way, some technology fix. Because what we do there might not be reversible and could be dangerous. And so, in closing, it's 2 o'clock. The pizza should be there.
Yes.
It is. Is the international climate change regime headed for a breakthrough? Is it the law of averages by? There should be now some benefit after all the efforts that have failed. Should it be time for some breakthrough? Or is it on its way to a breakout? Hopefully, for everyone's sake, the regime has a breakthrough, even if it results from a breakout. Whether the regime remains as it is or breaks out is secondary to the more important goal of arriving at a solution to the climate change problem. So I hope that there are some things that you learned today, and that the lecture wasn't too painful, and that the pizza solution is enough to alleviate your suffering. Thank you for listening. So if you have no questions, you can start eating pizza. Any questions? No, it's not graded. It can be if you want. If there's nothing you want to clarify, that's fine. I get paid whether I ask questions or not, answer questions or not. Diba, Gigi? Okay, so I don't have to answer your questions. No questions? Okay. Going. All right, thank you very much for patiently listening. Please enjoy your refreshments outside. Thank you.